Klaus Schwab's just a huckster who's in it for the money, and he's figured out this amazing grift. And all these companies pay the World Economic Forum millions of dollars a year to basically be part of some weird club.
Welcome to the show that the fact checkers warned you about. The one that debunks the mainstream narrative and gives you high signal, actionable content that helps you navigate the cloud world. It's Bomb Thrower TV with your host, Mark Jeftovic.
You know, I'm always listening to your podcasts, so I just thought it was just this green chicken avatar. I didn't realize you had the whole background and everything.
Oh yeah, we created this for our podcast, our video appearances. So,
oh my God, that's brilliant! I love it.
It works, So.
Yeah, because I was actually thinking before we started, I was just expecting a green chicken head that, does the little sort of glowy thing as the sound comes out. And I thought, okay, do I put my video on? Do I just put my avatar up? So we're just two avatars, but this is great. It's perfect. Yeah, well, I'll just do a quick on-the-fly intro. It's a pleasure to welcome Doomberg to Bomb Thrower TV. Over the last 12 to 18 months, they've taken the world by storm. FinTwit, Substack, co-hosting In Doom We Trust with Grant Williams, which I love his outlet as well. And now even here on Bomb Thrower TV. And I said they because I'm not a gender fluid pronoun dropper, but because my understanding is you're a team and you're you're the spokes chicken for that team. But when I listen to you and I read the posts, I get the sense you're the creative driving force behind the team. And I want to thank you for skipping Davos to come on Bomb Thrower TV.
Yeah, unlike just like Elon Musk, we too were not invited to Davos, surprisingly. And just a minor correction is This Week in Doom with Grant Williams. I wouldn't want to leave his excellent podcast misnamed. I choose to identify as a green chicken, but in fact, my pronouns are he, him, and it is a team. And I'm the head writer and the podcast person, but we have a pretty solid team of editors and some research behind the writing. And so, but yeah, it's great to be here and congrats on the launch and happy to have this discussion. Looking forward to it.
Thanks. Oh, so I'll correct myself. I said In Doom We Trust. Sorry, it's This Week in Doom is the show you do with Grant Williams.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry about that.
No worries.
But on the topic of this week being the Davos confab that neither one of us were invited to for some unfathomable reason, I just love your work, like in general, on energy and the energy is life equation. And when I compare it to what comes out of these shindigs, these narratives that come out of there, I find it hard not to equate environmentalism with Malthusianism.
Yeah, there's certainly a strain of it. And historically, if you look at the origins of the modern environmental movement, the Sierra Clubs of the world, it is just undeniable that they have a very ugly history of eugenics and Malthusianism at the foundation of the thought leaders. They just rolled out this relic Paul Ehrlich onto 60 Minutes again. And his, some of his greatest heroes in the books that he, when he writes his acknowledgments are known eugenicists and Malthusians. And they believe ultimately they're short human ingenuity is the way that I would describe it. They believe that the capacity for ingenuity is capped and that our resources are also capped, which means that by definition, there isn't enough to go around for everybody. And they would prefer there be less people. And I would suspect if you drill a little deeper, the people that they would rather not be on the planet don't look much like them. And we've written about this a few times. And to your point about, Davos and the World Economic Forum, to watch Al Gore bloviate once again about boiling the oceans.
600,000 Hiroshima bombs per day, Doomy, per day.
It's so absurd and practically obscene that I wonder whether we haven't reached peak ESG World Economic Forum here in 2023. You know, there comes a point where the children can step back and the adults can take back control over the steering wheel. And I wonder whether watching Al Gore scream about boiling oceans, which is such nonsense, you know, as I like to tag these people like him and John Kerry as noted scientists, Al Gore, screaming at the top of his lungs about how humans are boiling the oceans, which is just so, it can't be that any objective observer looking at this sort of global elite passing around hors d'oeuvres at the cocktail party, having flown in on their private jets, and wonder just how out of touch these people are, just how they just have no concept or idea how the average person makes it through the day. And you know, to hear John Kerry talk about how they're the chosen ones to save the planet, almost extraterrestrial, you know, it lays bare just how delusional these people are. Like, can you imagine what India and China think when John Kerry, who married a billionaire and you know, was born on third base and thought he hit a triple kind of guy, and he comes flying in on his corporate jet to tell them that they shall not develop, they shall not use their fossil fuels to lift their own people out of poverty. Then he jets over to Davos to pat himself on the back so hard that he probably leaves a bruise. It's just incredible to watch. It's truly obscene. Can't go on forever, and that which can't go on forever usually doesn't.
There's a lot in there to sort of, you know, double click on or whatever the expression is these days. But, you know, one of them is the fossil fuel is bad thing. And you frequently cite Alex Epstein, who said, and you bring in the whole premise that there's no solutions, especially when it comes to energy. There's only trade-offs. And so these people are walking around. I mean, I always say, like, they're walking around, like, sitting in the back of an Uber Black, like, maybe not a billionaire like Al Gore, but your typical, you know, purple-haired environmentalist or whatever. They're sitting in the back of an Uber Black, typing away on an iPhone, on their way to, like, some sort of shindig event about how bad capitalism is, fossil fuels are, and never the twain shall meet. And so, that idea that there is no good thing that comes out of fossil fuels, right? And that we just can flash cut from what we're doing now to these, you know, so-called friendly fuels or eco-friendly fuels like solar and windmills and things like that, without understanding at all the trade-offs involved in generating either type of energy. Well, we can talk about that for a sec before we hit into the next beat.
Sure. Alex Epstein likes to say you can't have a debate about fossil fuels without at least acknowledging the benefits, so that then you can measure the trade-offs. And we're working on a piece now. I'm not sure when we'll publish it. Sort of tentative title is Mission Impossible, where we're describing a phenomenon that we're going to name mass dissonance, where entire cultures believe things that are provably untrue and attempt to reorient their economies accordingly. And physics dictates that it just literally can't happen. And we're telling the story, of course, of the destruction of this small town in Germany, where Greta Thunberg inserted herself into the protests and posed for the cameras as she was pretending to be arrested by the police in the ultimate sort of theater. I don't know, I'm sure you've seen the video. That's viral on, you know. So at its core, if Greta had her way, Germany would have no coal being burned this winter. And imagine what would have happened in Germany if they had not rush to bring back on as much coal as they have done. And the German Greens, of course, have cut this fake deal to accelerate the phase out of coal from 2038 to 2030 in order to give cover for the destruction of this little hamlet in Germany in order to get more lignite out of the ground, which, as we say in the piece, is the cheapest and dirtiest form of the cheapest and dirtiest fossil fuels. And the complete pivot from you know, demanding that nuclear power plants be shut down to destroying villages to mine coal using some of the largest earth-eating machines the planet has ever seen. It just lays bare the entire farce of it all, the dissonance of it all. In Germany, the dissonance is that you can just completely cut out nuclear and fossil fuels and maintain a reasonable standard of living. I mean, there's a relief valve somewhere. The equilibrium has to be reached. And so when push came to shove, even the German Greens were ill prepared to smash the standard of living of their citizens to the extent that doing nothing ahead of this winter would have done. despite the fact that it's been incredibly mild. Looks like the weather's going to turn here soon, and we'll see. But it's just amazing for me to watch. Like, there's Greta being carried away by police officers in full riot gear, and if she had had her way, the country would have collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the piece we go on in this one, this will be the first of several where we talk about battery materials for either electric vehicles or storage on the grid. There's the mass dissonance there is that there just does not exist a sufficient amount of these materials to get anywhere near what everyone is modeling and everyone is projecting. And the stock market is completely wrong for certain equities. That they think that growth at a certain rate is never going to run up against a constraint, whether it's nickel, it's cobalt, it's lithium, it's rare earth metals, it's graphite, it's copper, it's zinc. We don't have enough of any of those things to get anywhere near these crazy projections that everyone assumes we have to do in order to save the planet. And then the last point is, what do these people think powers all of giant machines that will extract, concentrate, purify, and move these materials around the world? It's fossil fuels. It's all just so insane. And ultimately, as we saw in Germany, and as we'll see in the battery material sector, physics must be addressed at some point, and fantasies and the bubbles that they create will collapse. And all of this is just utterly predictable. We wish we could just skip to the answer. The only positive side is we at Doomberg will never run out of things to write about.
Right. Nor will we at Bomb Thrower. But when you're a physics person, and so you look at these systems in terms of physics and equilibriums, and what people don't really get, but you emphasize frequently, is that these release valves, when you're talking about a macroeconomic system like energy that powers people's everyday lives and supply chains and things like that, like everything is going to find its equilibrium. It's going to even itself out. But those valves are things like riots and famines and even kinetic wars in extreme cases. And I don't think people get that. And before I kick it over, an example, sort of a counterexample. Here in Ontario, I actually didn't know this number until one of your pieces. I didn't know that 60% of Ontario's energy comes from nuclear. And I'll bet you most Ontarians probably don't know that. So Ontario is a pretty liberal stronghold, or at least in Toronto and Ottawa. And there's a lot of environmentalism, and there's a lot of sort of left-wingism. And a lot of these people, it hasn't happened yet here, though, to the extent that it has in Germany, but they're soaking in it this energy abundance, right? This affluence that is the standard of living of Ontario that we've been used to for decades, and God willing, we will enjoy for decades more. But we've got nuclear reactors that are slated to Pickering's supposed to shut down in 25, I think, and there's never been, and you can't get a new one approved now to replace it, even though they planned to replace it a while ago. And so where I'm going with this is that people don't understand how physics intersects with their lives, and energy is the prime driver of physics. And so at what point do these people, I guess two questions, at what point do people sort of wake up and go, this isn't going to work anymore? You were saying maybe 2023 is peak ESG. I've been calling like peak cancel culture, peak wokeism, peak hysteria for about 10 years now. So I've been wrong for a long, long time. And, and do the people who are leading these policies into this, does John Kerry honestly believe he's on a mission from God to save the planet? For him, I kind of think he does believe it, but does a Klaus Schwab, right? I sense some disingenuousness there. And so if we need saving from anything, I think at that level, we need saving from elites that think they can save the world. But I know I put a lot in that question.
Yeah, let's start with Ontario, where you are. Minor correction. They get about 60% of their electricity from nuclear, which is different than energy, right?
I misspoke,
but that's okay. Ontario proves what's possible. So the Ontario electricity grid is powered 60% by nuclear power, 25% by hydro, which is renewable, 8% by wind, a little bit of solar, and then the balanced natural gas. They burn no coal whatsoever in your home province to generate electricity. And I've driven through Ontario. Looks like a very modern, first world, Western developed economy. I eat at nice restaurants. Toronto's a fine city. Hamilton's a fine city. London's a fine city. The highways, the 401 is a massive highway. It looks like a normal, nice place to live. Lots of nature, lots of lakes. The air is clean. And it's totally possible. And on Pickering, a little development, our friend Dr. Chris Kiefer over at Canadians for Nuclear Energy has managed to help win a reprieve for at least one of the Pickering reactors, I believe. So that's a story yet to be told. But the point of Ontario is we have the solution. It exists. Nuclear power. There is no path to decarbonization that does not drive right down the middle through nuclear power. It requires no technical inventions. It requires a few trade-offs that are totally manageable. The most prominent of which is we have to handle a relatively small amount of nuclear waste. Having said that, in the sort of benefits category is 90+% capacity factor, always on baseload power. And it works. It can work. It requires some it requires some investment and some political cutting of red tape. And what we see in these sort of areas is environmentalists will work the political system to impose as many regulations as possible, and then work the courts to sue these things and slow them down, radically driving up the expense. And then they turn around and say nuclear power is too expensive and it takes too long, even though they're the ones who are literally driving it. To shift a little bit, I think John Kerry believes his own stuff, genuinely. I think he authentically has a combination of hero complex and deep ignorance. I think Klaus Schwab, on the other hand, I'm in the Ben Hunt school of Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab's just a huckster who's in it for the money, and he's figured out this amazing grift. And all these companies pay the World Economic Forum millions of dollars a year to basically be part of some weird club. And I don't think he believes most of what he says. I think he's in it for the grift.
Yeah, and I think I think the grift is distinctly Marxist in nature or neo-Marxist in nature, which in my mind, I know what the definition of Marxism and socialism is supposed to be, but in my mind, it's basically let's convince everyone other than us to live at a relatively equal state of poverty so that we can, enjoy the trappings of elitism.
Yeah, there's no question that much of the, let's say, global climate change politics is driven around control.
Yeah.
And I just think that's undeniable. And that's why I think it'll never work in the US, for example. The US culture is just incompatible with the degree of control necessary. And we already saw Biden backtracking on a lot of stuff. Even the floating of the banning of the gas stoves triggered such a violent blowback that they're already walking this back from the edge. The American people, I live in the U.S. and I'm proud to be a U.S. citizen, and I consider myself to be patriotic and would like to see the U.S. do well. The U.S. is not going to tolerate this nonsense for much longer. And in fact, Joe Biden's complete panic around gasoline prices heading into the midterms is proof that we're nowhere near ready or willing or able to implement the kinds of sacrifices that these blowhards at the World Economic Forum are talking about as sort of a base case assumption, that we're all going to be walking around with carbon footprint apps that limit our consumption. I mean, you imagine this happening in the U.S. and it flying. It's just not going to happen. And you just good luck implementing it in Alabama, in Montana, in Michigan, in basically all of flyover country. You might get it done in the cities. Mm-hmm. This is never going to happen in the vast land area of the U.S. Population is a different story.
I hope you're right. And I think it's even going to have trouble in some cities in the States. I mean, in Florida, they're probably not going to go for that as long as it's
Texas, Florida, much of the Sun Belt, quote unquote. But still, I think California, New York, and the citizens of those cities in those states have no idea where stuff comes from, right? So they just assume
it comes from here, Doomy.
Yes,
this is where food comes from.
Yes, push a few buttons on a phone and food magically arrives. I'd like to say they're very busy sawing down the trunk of the tree to save a few branches. And that's just, again, this is not going to work. It's not going to be tolerated for much longer. Biden did everything in his power throughout the calendar year 2022 to ensure that as much fossil fuels were burned in the US as possible so that he could keep critical energy prices down ahead of the midterms. We haven't even begun to thinking about the sacrifices that everyone at the World Economic Forum assumes need to be made. And here, people panicked already at $5 gasoline, $5 gallon gasoline, which is a fraction of what people pay in Europe and in Canada. And it was intolerable politically. Now imagine, what happens when the grid collapses in New England, as it inevitably will. Like there's going to be a reckoning, and ultimately, people's standard of living are defined by how much energy they get to waste. People everywhere want a higher standard of living. Those two things are critical to understand about how humans will behave when confronted with elitists who are just going to assume that the poor people of the world will be willing to stay poor, and that the people in the West who have obtained some decent level of standard of living will sacrifice it in the name of the goddess Gaia. It's not going to happen, in my view.
Yeah, it's the famous quote by Munger, who I've kind of lost a little. I'm not as much of a Munger fan as I used to be because he's so anti Bitcoin, and me. But anyhow, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. Right.
Yeah.
A lot of these grand programs require people to make decisions and choices that are against their own best interests or against their own interests. And I've personally believed the whole climate alarmism, the whole climate crisis was really just varnish for or veneer, for the impending end of the global monetary system, right? We've got this debt bubble that we can't pay off. There's no way we can ever, like America, Canada, Europe, the whole world, we can't pay off this debt bubble. Something's going to give. At some point, we're going to have a monetary regime change, I call it. And so this is like a kind of steering committee effort to say, we need to get the rabble to ratchet down their standard of living. I don't think this premise that if the entire world lived at the standard of living of an America or a Canada, we would need 4 Earths. I think that just completely overlooks the efficiency gains we make across the board in almost everything that we can actually plot and chart and see that, we're getting higher food yields and less land, and we're, all of those kinds of things. So I really think that the existing system, the existing entrenched elites really do think it's existential that everybody else ratchets down their standard of living, and that means wasting less energy. That's such a great way to put it. And that's and the whole thing is actually coming to a head over the next, call it, decade. Like you're saying, we're at peak ESG this year. I think so too, in the sense that I can't see these narratives surviving beyond the end of this decade. Maybe even sooner, because things tend to be moving faster than when I say something's going to take 5 years, it happens 3 months later. So
let's take a couple of things, because you've said sort of triggered 2 different thoughts in my head. So I'll take them in order. The first thought is back to this sort of Malthusian, let's say, what's the word I'm looking for? This Malthusian belief that humans are incapable of sustaining the current population size, let alone sort of a reasonable growth in population over time. The Earth is not a closed system. The Earth is bombarded every day with an enormous amount of energy from the sun. And once we build enough machines to figure out how to effectively harness that, either in the form of improved yields or solar power, which I'm still a reasonably strong proponent of, especially the development of technologies that could allow us to harness it in a way that circumvents the intermittency problem. We are bombarded with so much energy from the sun every day that it would be foolish for us to stop trying to develop it, to harness it, to increase people's standard of living. So that's step one. Like, it's 10,000 times more energy than we need every day being bombarded from the sun. The total photosynthesis is less than 1% of the sun's energy, and then a fraction of that is edible for humans. So when you think about how much sort of just imagine if electricity were free, our capacity to grow food indoors with precision lighting and thermal control and stuff would be off the charts, and your area, would be volumetric instead of two-dimensional. There's solutions to these problems. And with the combination of nuclear and the amount of energy that's being bombarded to the Earth every day, and selective use of fossil fuels in situations where they're simply irreplaceable, we'll all just be fine. And then, so, there's that scenario. Now back to sort of this peak ESG. I'll tell you who is not going to put up with this nonsense beyond the sort of American flyover country: China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. Pick your favorite. Korea. Pick your favorite countries that look inward first and survey their populace to understand, like that great speech that from Oxford, the debate club that went viral, which I'm sure you saw. Everybody has seen it at this point. Like, they're not going to choose to stay poor. Xi Jinping doesn't care about climate change. Xi Jinping cares about domestic tranquility, which is why you saw how quickly he pivoted from dynamic zero COVID to what's COVID? COVID Nova, right? I mean, literally overnight, it was a bit flip. As soon as there was, like, say what you want about the Chinese Communist Party, when there are social disruptions, they listen, they pay attention. You might not want to be the individuals participating in the disruption, but the message was heard, the message was sent, the message was acted upon in very short order, and the propaganda totally flipped.
Yeah.
The propaganda in China right now is dynamic zero COVID is what bridged us from the very dangerous variants to the relatively benign ones that we're dealing with now. And now that the wave has peaked, it's totally back to normal. And that's the propaganda inside of China. And that's it. Like, they're going to do it. That shows you that they are highly attuned to the population. And one of the biggest deals and look, no Western analyst can claim to understand China. And as many times as I've traveled there, and as much experience as I have with the country, and as much as I've read about it, I'm guessing from the West just like anybody else. So let's put that out there. One of the grand bargains between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party is you can take away all our rights as much as you want, but you better keep us fed.
Yeah.
And as long as there's food on the table, which is why pork, for example, is such a huge cultural thing in China. As long as there's food on the table, the Chinese people will tolerate a lot. One of the reasons why the whole zero COVID thing collapsed is because it was very difficult for people in the cities to get food. Like, you want to understand Chinese politics, understand Chinese bellies. Like, this is how you analyze China, in my view, and the people that I respect the most that have pretty good track record in that area come to the same conclusion. And so this is why, of course, when you look at sort of Chinese strategic investments overseas, like they bought Syngenta, and they're always sort of at critical choke points in the ag sector. And it's not because they're trying to develop power over the West. They're trying to control the flow of nutrients into their home country. And so, they're not going to look. I mean, they're building out more coal than the world has shut down in the past 15 years. They're building 150 nuclear reactors in parallel. And, watch what they do, not what they say.
That's why things like single-use plastic bans in Canada make me so crazy, because it's just so detached from reality that our policymakers literally come out and say we're creating a sustainable world, we're saving the environment, whereas the entire energy output of Canada is like a rounding error in the Chinese economy. And and we think we're going to solve something by eliminating bread clips. I had to buy contraband plastic bread clips from the States because these cardboard things drive me batty, right? So I've got this secret drawer where I've got ivermectin, some other stuff, and some plastic bread clips, right? It's just ridiculous. And you mentioned it. You were actually on the Bonner Research podcast the other day with Joel Bowman. I love Bill Bonner. I've been following him for 30 years. Changed my life when I discovered Daily Reckoning as a younger person. But it was I kind of winced when you said Canada and Australia are these two countries that should be these global economic powerhouses, especially with respect to energy and commodities. And here we are, taking victory laps for hobbling the population and crippling the economy and trying to sell Europeans who want to buy LNG from us, and we're trying to sell them like unicorn farts 10 years out. And it's just like, it's unrelenting. It just keeps going and going and going. This ridiculous narrative that Canada, we could shut off all the lights in Canada and unplug, like park all the cars and ground all the planes, and the world will never even notice we're gone, really, except for like the lack of hockey. That's about it.
Yeah, and the rest of the world is mostly caught up to Canada and hockey as well. And
Oh,
so,
you watch your words there.
look, I love Canada deeply. I know the country well. And what I said on with Joel on the Bonner Show is, if you take the endowed resources, the three sort of per capita energy commodity superpowers are actually Canada, Australia, and Russia. Relatively small populations with huge, unthinkably large blessings of coal and minerals and oil and gas and you name it. And Canada in particular, fertile farmlands and great institutions. For all of our sort of picking on Justin Trudeau, Canada has fantastic institutions. Like Canada is a fantastic place to live. And once Canada gets its political act together, Canada could be an energy superpower. And one of the things we've said is if you drew a circle around NAFTA, the US, Canada, and Mexico, God, what an endowed set of resources that one particular region has. Fertilizer, the world's best farmland, educated workforce, free trade between the countries, of course, the U.S. military to protect all of it. It truly is a spectacular, and Canada in particular. And so that's why I'm actually hopeful and I'm optimistic, because when we do, this is all just politics, and politics is much easier to change than physics.
That really stands out in a lot of your writing and a lot of your appearances is you listen to this, and what makes it so frustrating is we're not up against technological constraints, right? We're up against regulatory constraints, and regulatory constraints are they're artificial. They're made up. They're in somebody's head that says like everybody else has to adhere to this because this is what I believe to be true. It's not, there are no technological showstoppers from preventing us from doing like raising everybody's standard of living, even bringing so-called third world countries up into a modern industrialized or leapfrogging into even post-industrialized economies, knowledge-based economies. It can happen. There's ways to do it for everybody. And we have these Malthusians telling us that, no, actually, we've figured it all out. And we have to go this other way where you all basically live in uniform poverty and misery and listen to what we tell you to do.
Yeah, the pessimism of the Malthusians, which is the word I was seeking earlier, is totally unjustified. And as we've said, there are no technical challenges to, for example, okay, let's go back, take a step back, because I get some crap from people who are totally convinced that CO2 is not a problem and that we shouldn't be fighting about the solutions. We should be arguing about what they would call the global climate hoax. That's not something we've indulged in. And we focus our efforts on the following. It is totally reasonable to decide that we would like to reorient our society around the following equation. In the numerator sits total standard of living that we can allocate to every human on Earth. And in the denominator sits carbon emissions. And we want to optimize that ratio. Fine. If I take that as an axiom, I don't need to win the global warming is a hoax argument to show how silly we're being, because we can even do that. We can do that through nuclear power. We can do that through selective use of fossil fuels where they're used and needed most. We can do it with selective distribution of batteries for focusing on hybrids versus full BEVs, which are a giant waste of materials. So there are literally no technical barriers to the generation of bountiful energy for every human on Earth. It is 100% political, period. And so we are therefore proactively choosing not to do so, which makes me wonder whether if we invented a magic solar solution tomorrow that somehow defied the laws of physics and allowed us to create bountiful energy that was not intermittent, that we could distribute cheaply, they would find a reason to be opposed to.
Like cold fusion, like if someone actually said, "We got it,
Or
it works, it's here."
that fusion in general, like we wrote a piece on fusion, which basically fusion is unneeded and will be used by the political opponents of nuclear to say, let's not invest in nuclear now because fusion is just around the horizon. And then when fusion gets closer to reality, they'll flip and they'll be opposed to it with vigor. And so don't tell me that technologies need like this whole nuclear waste canard. It's a canard.
I was going to ask you about that because you mention it often, and I'm like, okay, so how do we, as a society, as a civilization, what are the best practices for dealing with nuclear waste?
Just shoot it underground, 300 meters, and that's it. And you just let it decay. I challenge you to find a single person injured by a nuclear waste spill around the world. We have people dying on oil and gas rigs all the time. We have slave labor being used to make solar. Not a single person that I'm aware of has ever been injured from nuclear waste. Now, talk about Fukushima, that's a different issue, but nuclear waste as an argument against nuclear is a total and complete canard. The total amount of nuclear waste ever generated could easily fit in a basketball court, I believe, or a football field, a couple of meters, 10, 20 meters high. Pick your favorite. Depends if you're talking about the US or the world. It's manageable. Again, as far as trade-offs go, you seal the thing 5 times over in various forms of concrete, shoot it 300 meters underground, and then try to figure out a way that would actually ever hurt somebody. It just wouldn't.
Right.
I just wouldn't. And if it did, you treat them. Like people die eventually. You hope that they die from natural causes after living long and fulfilling lives. But like we all meet our maker eventually. So everything is a risk and everything is a trade-off compared to the immediate devastating consequences of choking off fossil fuels. Handling a little bit of nuclear waste is literally a nothing burger.
I wasn't going to bring this up until you mentioned we're all going to meet our maker someday. And it was an article during COVID in the early innings of COVID 2020, and it was in the Wall Street Journal. So I actually had to look at it to like, where am I seeing this? Is this really in the Wall Street Journal and not on like, some weird, airy-fairy site? That because of, it was this transhumanist wet dream of like, well, you know what, we should just technologically eliminate death and then live in the metaverse. And here's 4 different ways to do it, through transhumanism. And it was, and at the time I said, this is going to become the religion of the technocracy, right? We're all going to like massively reduce our carbon footprints because we're all going to live in the metaverse, really. So it's going to take hardly any energy at all. And so I guess it's not really a question. It's just, there are people in these, anointed circles who are actually thinking we don't all have to meet our maker eventually. We can just, upload our consciousness into the metaverse and live there.
Well, I'm a little bit pessimistic on our ability to solve the ultimate last unsolved problem of physics, which is consciousness. And so I'm going to pretend that I have a limited time in the real world, or at least not pretend. I'm going to live as though I have a limited time in the real world. I think that having an infinite life expectancy would be a horrible curse. I'm quite happy being a human and doing what I can on this planet to do as well by as many people as possible, leaving something useful and valuable for my children. And for example, I'm proud of the legacy of the Doomberg pieces that will live on in the internet when this green chicken is somebody else's lunch sandwich. And that's just to everything there is a season. I'm not a super religious person, but I am a spiritual person. And I don't spend too much time thinking about preserving whatever it is that my consciousness represents in some sort of egotistical demand that I persist beyond my anointed time on this planet.
Right. I'm going to pivot just a little bit because I am the Bitcoin capitalist, and I've heard you talk about this a couple of times. We're not going to dwell on it. Bitcoin mining, climate crisis. So I hear you you dissect the climate crisis and or so-called crisis and energy from every different angle, and I've heard you speak favorably about Bitcoin mining in terms of having a role to be able to smooth out grid demand in certain places, peaker, what do you call them, peak or something,
Peaker plants, yeah.
peaker plants, that kind of thing. Is there like, I've never heard you say, I've heard you criticize Bitcoin not and crypto from different angles that were all very valid. Like we've had a couple of exchanges and conversations about Tether and crypto and that kind of thing. I've never heard you say, and Bitcoin mining contributes to global warming. That's one of the things I've never heard you say. I'm not trying to pull words out of your mouth or put them in your mouth, but I've never heard you say that.
Let's separate a few things here, and just I'll give you my opinions on things, and then we could have the discussion from there. I have zero use for crypto, and I define crypto as everything other but Bitcoin.
Right.
I personally am a no coiner, so I've never owned any Bitcoin. But as an outside observer, I can agnostically see that there is an awful lot of people for whom Bitcoin is valuable, and there's a bit of a network effect. And for the very same phenomenon that makes gold valuable, although gold has a much longer historical track record, if we're being totally honest, I can understand why people would ascribe value to what they believe would be a digital variant of gold. And then I can also deeply sympathize with much of the underlying desire to have a thing called Bitcoin, because it is perceived, at least, to be a ticket out of the modern fiat ecosystem and all of the control and power that comes with it. So crypto, I think we could agree, there's some interesting technologies being developed in the crypto space, but crypto as defined today is nothing more than an integrated set of Ponzi schemes that are all going through a domino of collapse as we speak. Bitcoin has been adjudicated in the US to be an asset. There's a legal way to own it and to be taxed on the transactions that you use it. And so when you combine the fact that it has a certain amount of regulatory clarity, it is an asset. It is not a security. Most other cryptos are securities, as we're finding out, as we've been saying. So Bitcoin, I understand. There's obviously there's value, in the network and in the network effect of the people who are mentally ascribing value to it, which cannot and should not be ignored as an analyst. Much less of that in the crypto side. Now, Bitcoin mining, given as an axiom that there's value in Bitcoin, and there is value in Bitcoin. People will give you fiat money for Bitcoin at volume today. One of the biggest challenges in managing a grid, especially when you introduce intermittent power sources like solar and wind, is how do you handle that intermittency? And one of the big challenges with the current mostly unworkable solution is you have these what are called peaker plants that exist only to turn on when extra power is needed because solar and wind have let you down. Those plants make no economic sense for anybody to own if they can't be doing something else in the rest of their time. Okay.
Got it. Yeah.
And so if you are a power plant and you're going to say to the state of New York, we will run 24/7, and the moment you need us, we will give you the electricity you need. We will be your swing producers of electricity to help you dampen the volatility that you yourself have introduced because of these intermittent powers. All of this, of course, is totally avoidable if we just had nuclear power everywhere. So in a world where nuclear is proficient or is prolific and is everywhere, you don't need peaker plants, and therefore you don't need Bitcoin mining to help stabilize the grid. So I take two axioms. Bitcoin is valuable and renewables are here. Given those two axioms, there is an economic case to be had for when there's too much electricity being produced in the grid and renewable and solar are overproducing versus what is needed. You could be swinging off your power production to the grid and onto making Bitcoin or mining Bitcoin, right? Making Bitcoin sounds like mining gold, but that's all these words are very similar for a reason. So you can imagine a suite of plants, because you don't ever have to mine for Bitcoin in theory as a Bitcoin miner. You could turn it off. And so there is a scenario where you incentivize the owners of peaker plants by allowing them to mine for Bitcoin and being the swing producers of electricity that allows you to dampen variance in the grid that makes it so challenging and so expensive when you introduce intermittent renewables. And so given the axioms that Bitcoin is valuable and renewables are here, Bitcoin mining makes a lot of sense. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. As you're seeing in New York, they're outlawing it. And we profiled this one company, Greenwich Generation, the Greenwich Generation Station, in the Seneca Lake, those Finger Lakes in New York. But they're not going to have that. They're not going to have a power plant that is mostly dedicated to mining for Bitcoin. And they will turn around and say Bitcoin is adding to global warming because you're burning natural gas in this case to mine for Bitcoin. You cannot draw conclusions about a system. You cannot draw conclusions about a component of a system without considering the total first and second and third order impacts on the system. You see, and so if you want a stable grid, then having peaker plants are necessary if you're going to introduce renewables. And if peaker plants are necessary, somebody has to pay for those things. And to make them economical would allow you to introduce more and more renewable energy into the grid. And so it is what it is. There's no room for nuance in this debate, but we try to have a first principles based nuanced view on everything, including Bitcoin mining. So that's our view.
Right. This sort of leads us to something else. We're getting to the top of the hour, so I'll let you go soon. But I want to talk a little bit about CBDCs, which I kind of view as the anti-Bitcoin. And I know you're concerned about them too. And I see like the drumbeat is accelerating all through the world. There's a lot of movement, testing, white papers, policy positions being invoked. There's still nobody outside of China really ready with a CBDC ready to go. The few countries that have launched them, they've kind of stiffed, but they're still probably coming. When I think about CBDCs, and what I know about governments, I don't see them not morphing into being a kind of dystopian social credit system, and for me, when I think of CBDCs and I just differentiate them from something like Bitcoin, it will not be, they won't be tokenized per se. There will not be key pairs. You won't be able to have your private key. I think you won't even be able to save in the sense that we've known traditionally. Negative interest rates, expiry dates on cash, and then again, morphing eventually into that social credit system. And this is why I'm so into Bitcoin, because I think it's the anti-CBDC. But I know that you also have these concerns about CBDCs and the privacy aspects of them and so forth.
I think CBDCs crush the last vestiges of privacy that we have, and they should be vehemently opposed. And it is just impossible to imagine that the temptation to impart that degree of control over the population will be resisted by the same crowd that is drinking the cult of climate change over at the WEF. Like, you have to be a fool to look what happened in China. The QCR codes for COVID were immediately used to control the population.
Yeah.
You protest, okay, boom, code is red. You can't even get into your own apartment.
Yeah.
The technology for much of this was developed by Western companies. Like, this is coming, right? And it's probably futile, to be honest with you. I think it's actually going to come. And we've said the way in which it'll be implemented is the next time we need a stimulus, you'll get an extra 10 grand if you log into your FedCoin account and capture your CBDCs. And it's going to come. It's still worth fighting against. I mean, it doesn't have to be inevitable, but it sure feels inevitable. But the scenario where they decide that you've bought too much sugared sodas this week is totally real. Are you sure you want to have another case of beer, Mark? You've sure been sucking them back these past 2 weeks. And boy, you've driven. I see you've put on a lot of miles on your car, and even though it's a plug-in hybrid, you've still combusted this amount of gasoline. And we saw that. Yes, we know that you live this far away from your parents, and maybe your mother is ill. But yeah, that's just too bad. You're not allowed to buy gasoline now. Like that's coming.
Yeah.
And if you think that the powers that be are going to be like, what would Trudeau have done to the truckers?
Yeah. I was thinking when you started talking, it's like, imagine if they had them last February.
Yeah, of course they would have used them.
Oh,
Of
yeah.
course they would have used them. But this is why what Justin Trudeau did was so dastardly and needs to be rejected. Like with
On the bright side, so this is how I look at this. I agree with you that I think CBDCs are inevitable. And it's to what extent are they going to, are they going to be as dystopian as you say? I mean, I was just before we started today, I was reading the latest white paper from the Digital Dollar Project, which was the guy, he's the former CFTC commissioner. His name is escaping me right now, but I was a quick scan and I'm like, this is actually saying all the right things that a guy like me or you would want to see. I don't necessarily believe that this viewpoint will prevail. Like it should be tokenized, it should be privatized, it should, I applaud those ideals coming out of those circles, but I think it's either a creeping sort of pivot into what we're talking about, or it's sort of designed from the outset like this. And this is why, I think Trudeau almost crashed the Canadian banking system when he did that. That's why It's like he walked it back a week later, and then days after he rammed the Emergency Act. Like all that happened before the Emergency Act was even ratified. And then he rammed it through the House of Commons, and then it was gone 3 days later. And it was all very, like, on the outside looking in, it's like, what just happened? And he's like, oh, crisis averted. But what happened behind the scenes, when you looked at like the big five banks crashed and what was going on, like he started a run on the banks. He started a panic behind the scenes. He almost crashed the Canadian banking system. And to me, that was a microcosm of this tension we're going to see between CBDCs and Bitcoin and digital bearer assets, and even other, like, I still like my gold, right? I'm still a gold bug at heart, and I just like stuff that just can't be debased or taken away from me. But I actually don't see CBDCs actually winning in the marketplace of thought. And so the only way a CBDC is going to happen is if it's a complete totalitarian scenario. And I actually don't think that will succeed I'm still an optimist. I don't think that's going to succeed in the West. I think you're right that we're sort of at peak Malthusianism, peak ESG, peak wokeism. And I think saner minds are going to prevail over the next bunch of years. And maybe the dollar will digitize, it'll become like a stable coin or something. But I think CBDC project after project are going to stiff in the West. And there will be these abortive attempts to make them into sort of like a Black Mirror episode. But I really don't see, them winning in the long term in the West anyhow.
Well, it is an existential threat to freedom and privacy. And so our view is that we should relentlessly critique them and never let up.
I agree with that for sure.
Because the moment you let up, they'll sneak right in.
Some people want, there are people, like I was on another podcast a few weeks ago, and it kind of occurred to me, like while I was talking to them, it was the Canadian Bitcoiners podcast. I said, the CBDC is going to live here, and it's not going to be regulations and quotas. It's going to be gamified. And so people are going to be like, oh, I'm reducing my meat intake. And then these little things are going to explode on their phone and make pretty patterns at them. And this point system's going to go up. And a lot of people, I think there will be this element of self-selection, especially what you're saying in the cities. Like people are like, oh yeah, this is like, there'll be leaderboards and stuff for compliance to the state. And it will be more of a gamification. That will be the attraction to these systems. I hope I'm right in that they're going to have a very difficult time forcing people into these systems. If they're trying to incentivize or induce people into these systems, I can't really do anything about anyone who just sort of knowingly enters into them and says, yeah, this is great. Okay, well, then live your life that way. What I hope for, and why I sort of push so hard on the digital bearer asset and Bitcoin front is that there's going to be so much momentum and impetus on the other side of that equation that it's never an issue of will the governments allow it? It's just how do they coexist with it?
Well, this is why we predicted that the way it'll be rolled out is through excess benefits in the next stimulus. So you'll still get some benefits, but how many Canadians would log into Trudeau Coin for $10,000?
Loon Coin, yeah,
it'd be a lot.
Oh yeah.
$10,000 is a lot of money for most people, and maybe it's a smaller number, maybe it's a bigger number, but there will be, if and when they decide to try, it will be almost irresistible to most people. That's how they'll design it. And then once you're in, it'll be all Robin Hooded out to make you trade more, so to speak, with the gamification stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But once you cross that the piece we wrote on this, which we published in December, was crossing the Rubicon. And, and so you can look it up on doomberg.substack.com. But it's worth fighting against. I think it's a losing battle. I'm a bit of a pessimist in this case, but doesn't mean that we're not going to try and that others shouldn't try as well. I do think this is a dastardly invention. And our opposition to them is vehement, as I said earlier.
Okay, so suffice it to say, you're more optimistic on the energy and human progress side. I'm a little more optimistic on the failure of the CBDC side. So between the two of us, we're almost optimistic.
Almost.
Yeah. We're at the top.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just a last thought. I know that we're at the top of the areas. Ultimately, we are optimistic. I mean, humans have survived all manner of tragedy, environmental disasters, political disasters, war, strongman dictators, you name it. Ultimately, there's more of us than there has ever been. And there, as a proportion of us, fewer of us in poverty than has ever been. And we're living as long as we ever have. And by and large, the human spirit, we are, dead to nuts along the human spirit. And ultimately, if you can't, identify the risks and manage them in what we would sort of call defensive pessimism, then you're more susceptible to worse outcomes than you could otherwise achieve. And so it's worth fighting for. But I don't want anybody watching this or listening to it to misconstrue our concerns about these areas as being sort of perpetually pessimistic, because ultimately we're deeply along the human spirit, the human ingenuity, the human capacity, and it's just a superior way to live.
And so well said. And the other ace up our sleeve, the other magic bullet that, freedom lovers and optimists of the human enterprise have on their side is these top-down Malthusian, misanthropic, Marxist dictatorship constructs don't actually work. Like central planning doesn't work. And so no matter what happens, if it even appears to work for a while, the long run is against it. And so there's at least that you cannot centrally plan something like the human endeavor. So
yeah, wholeheartedly agree. It's been a blast, Mark. Thanks.
How do people follow you, Doomy?
Yeah, so primarily all of our work is published on doomberg.substack.com. We publish 6 to 8 pieces a month, and we are 100% subscriber supported, which is the business model we have chosen. Free subscribers to Doomberg get pretty extensive previews to our pieces, but to see the full piece, you have to be a paid subscriber. And we're also on Twitter, although less so recently. It's just become a bit of a toxic place, and we have found that podcasts are probably a better venue for us to showcase our work. But we are on Twitter, still pretty active, at Doomberg T. Add the word T to the end of Doomberg. We have, I think, 232,000 followers at last look. So we do have a big account and we enjoy tweeting, but as a small team and as much as we publish, we're sort of reprioritizing our work towards podcast appearances and writing for the Substack. And so, but like I said, it's been a blast, and looking forward to coming back sometime in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'm a premium subscriber. I highly recommend it. Thanks so much, Doomberg. It's great. You're everywhere out there, and I really appreciate the support you give to other content creators. And this has been great. Thank you.
Awesome. Have a great weekend.
You too. Take care.